Before the sun touches the valley floor, the mist rises. It rises like breath from the mouth of the earth itself, slow and deliberate, filling the gorges between mountains that have no interest in being named. The river below the Urubamba carves its eternal path through stone that remembers ice, remembers fire, remembers the weight of oceans that died long before the first human footprint pressed into Andean soil. And then, as dawn splits the horizon with light the color of old copper, something emerges, not quickly, not with drama, but with the quiet inevitability of a dream that has always been there, just beneath the surface of waking. Terraces, stairways, walls that conform to no logic except their own. A city, if it can be called a city perched on a ridge so narrow, so improbable, that the clouds themselves seem confused about whether to rise above it or swallow it whole. Machu Picchu. The name means old peak in Quechua, though the people who built it may have called it something else entirely. Or perhaps they called it nothing at all. Perhaps it needed no name, because it was never meant to be spoken of, only inhabited, only felt. From this vantage point 8,000 feet above the sea, cradled between two mountains like a secret kept between brothers, the world below seems distant, unreal, a place of lesser concerns. Here, the air is thin and cold and carries the scent of stone and wild orchids. Here, the light moves differently, bending around peaks, fracturing into colors that have no names in any language still spoken. The stones are gray-green with lichen. The walls curve and interlock with a precision that suggests not construction, but growth, as if the city itself were carved not by human hands, but coaxed into being by some patient, invisible gardener who understood that rock, given enough time and the right whisper, could be taught to bloom. Who first stood here and imagined this? Who looked at a ridge barely wide enough for a condor to land and thought, yes, here we will build something that lasts longer than empires? The wind offers no answer. It only moves through the empty plazas and along the silent staircases, carrying with it the faint sound of water trickling through channels cut into stone 5 centuries ago or longer, depending on which story you believe. Because Machu Picchu is not one story. It is many, layered like the terraces themselves, each level revealing something new, something that contradicts what came before, something that asks more questions than it answers. From a distance, it looks like a ruin. Up close, it looks like a blueprint, a template, a message written in granite and shadow, waiting for someone to learn the language it speaks. The clouds close in again, and the city vanishes, but it does not disappear. It simply returns to the place it has always been hovering between the knowable and the imagined, between history and myth, between the earth and the sky. Somewhere in the valley below, a farmer wakes. He will tend his fields as his father did, and his father before him. He will glance up at the ridge and see nothing but mist. But he knows it is there. He has always known. Machu Picchu does not need to be seen to exist. It simply waits. The year is 1911, and a young American historian with more ambition than funding is sweating his way up a jungle trail that has no official name and leads. He has been told to nothing of particular importance. His name is Hiram Bingham III. He is 35 years old, a lecturer at Yale, and he has come to Peru in search of Vilcabamba, the legendary last refuge of the Inca kings, the place where the final embers of an empire smoldered out beneath Spanish boots and missionary crosses. He has been pointed in a dozen directions by locals who smile politely and offer conflicting advice. Some say Vilcabamba is to the north. Others say west. One old man insists it is underwater now, claimed by a lake that has no name. But a farmer named Melchor Artiga mentions, almost as an afterthought, that there are ruins up on the ridge above the river. Old stones. Nothing special. Tourists never go there. Bingham decides to go anyway. The climb is exhausting. The trail is slick with mud and moss. winding through cloud forests so dense that sunlight arrives in fragments, filtering through ferns the size of houses. Artiga walks ahead, machete in hand, cutting back vines that reclaim the path almost as quickly as they are cleared. And then, after hours of ascent, the trees open. What Bingham sees stops him mid-step. Terraces, dozens of them, cascading down the mountainside in perfect symmetry. Stone walls fitted so tightly that a knife blade cannot slip between the blocks. Temples with trapezoidal windows that frame the peaks beyond like paintings. Plazas that seem designed not for crowds, but for silence. He will later write that it felt like walking into a dream, that the ruins seemed too perfect, too intact to be real, that he half expected the city to vanish if he blinked. But it does not vanish. Bingham photographs everything. He sketches maps. He takes notes in a leather journal that will eventually make its way into the archives of Yale University, where scholars will spend the next century arguing about what, exactly, he found. The story that emerges from his expedition is a neat one. Bingham discovered Machu Picchu. He brought it to the attention of the world. He revealed a lost city that had been hidden for centuries beneath jungle and cloud. But the story is not quite accurate. Melchor Artiga knew about the ruins. So did the other farmers in the valley. So did the families who had been living in the area for generations, using the terraces to grow crops, sheltering in the stone buildings during storms. To them, Machu Picchu was not lost. It was simply old. Simply there, a part of the landscape, no more remarkable than the mountains themselves. Bingham did not discover Machu Picchu. He popularized it. He reframed it. He took a place that belonged to the Quechua-speaking descendants of the Inca and turned it into a symbol, a mystery, a destination for outsiders seeking something they could not name. The distinction matters, because the question is not, who found Machu Picchu? The question is, who built it, and why did they leave? And to that question, Bingham had no answer. Neither did the farmers. Neither did the scholars who followed, armed with shovels and theories and grant money. The city kept its secrets. Meanwhile, far to the south, in the archives of Cusco, documents gathered dustland deeds, colonial reports, fragments of testimony from the trials of Inca nobles interrogated by Spanish priests. Buried in those documents were mentions of royal estates, of hidden refuges, of places in the mountains where emperors went to speak with the gods. But no one had yet connected the dots. No one had yet asked, what if Machu Picchu was not lost at all? What if it was simply forgotten deliberately, carefully, by people who knew that some cities are safer when the world believes they do not exist? To walk through Machu Picchu is to walk through a language you almost recognize. The grammar is their walls, doorways, staircases, but the syntax is alien, constructed according to rules that make sense only to the builders and the stone itself. Start at the agricultural sector, where terraces step down the mountainside like a frozen waterfall of earth and rock. Each terrace is a marvel of engineering, layered with gravel for drainage, filled with soil carried up from the valley, held in place by retaining walls that have survived 5 centuries of rain and earthquake, without mortar, without collapse, without compromise. The Inca understood something fundamental about mountains, that they are always moving, always settling, always responding to the pull of gravity and the slow violence of tectonic drift. So they built walls that could move too, walls that flex, walls that breathe. Every stone is unique. No 2 blocks share the same shape. And yet they fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, interlocking like the scales of some sleeping reptile that might, at any moment, wake and slither back into the peaks. Ascend the stairs, hundreds of them, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, each step carved from a single piece of granite, and you enter the urban sector. Here, the city reveals its internal logic. Residential compounds clustered around courtyards, fountains fed by an aqueduct that still functions, temples aligned to the solstices, and the sacred peaks that loom on every horizon. The Temple of the Sun is perhaps the most elegant structure in the entire complex. Its walls curve in a perfect semicircle, wrapping around a natural boulder that has been carved and polished until it gleams like obsidian. Windows face east and west, framing the rising and setting sun during key moments of the year-winter solstice. Summer solstice, the equinoxes when day and night hold equal weight. Orthodox archaeology tells us this was a solar observatory, a place where priests tracked time, calibrated the calendar, ensured that planting and harvest aligned with the cycles of the heavens. But stand inside the temple at dawn, when the first light spills through the window and strikes the carved stone at its center, and you feel something else. Something older than calendars, a presence perhaps, or simply the memory of presence, the echo of rituals performed so many times that the space itself retains the shape of them, like a handprint pressed into wet clay. Move deeper into the complex, and the architecture becomes stranger. There is a structure called the Royal Tomb, though no bodies have ever been found in it. A cave hollowed out beneath a temple, its interior carved with niches and altars, and a stone table that might have been used for mummification or for something else entirely. There is the Temple of the Three Windows, its massive trapezoidal openings looking out over the valley below. Why three? Why not two or four? No one knows. But the number three was sacred to the Inca three worlds, three levels of existence: the underworld of the dead, the earthly realm of the living, the celestial sphere of the gods. And then there is the stonework itself. In most of Machu Picchu, the construction is fine but conventional. Rectangular blocks, fitted tightly, laid in regular courses. But in certain places around the Temple of the Sun, in the retaining walls of the upper terraces, the stones become something else: polygonal, irregular, interlocking in ways that seem less like construction and more like sculpture, each block shaped to fit against its neighbors with a precision that defies explanation. How did they do it? The orthodox answer is patient labor, bronze chisels, stone hammers, weeks of work per block, grinding and fitting and grinding again until the surfaces met perfectly. Possible, certainly, but exhausting. And it does not explain why the Inca chose to build this way only in certain places, only in structures tied to the most sacred functions. Some researchers have suggested that the polygonal technique was a status symbol, a display of wealth and power, proof that the emperor could command the labor of thousands for aesthetic purposes alone. Others wonder if there was a practical reason. Earthquake resistance, perhaps. The irregular shapes distribute stress more evenly, allowing the walls to shift and settle without cracking. But there is a third possibility, one that archaeologists rarely discuss in academic journals, but whisper about over drinks at conferences: that the polygonal walls are older, that they were already here when the Inca arrived. That Machu Picchu, for all its Inca pottery and Inca bones and Inca terraces, might be built atop something far more ancient a foundation, laid by people whose names have been lost, whose language has been forgotten, whose very existence has been erased by time and jungle and the relentless revisionism of empire. The walls do not answer. They only stand, silent and patient, holding their secrets with the same grip they hold each other. In 2002, a team of archaeologists working in one of the residential sectors uncovered something that did not fit the timeline. Charcoal, not unusual in itself. Ancient peoples used fire for cooking, for warmth, for ritual. But this charcoal was located beneath a layer of construction fill, sealed under stone that had been laid, according to every accepted model, in the mid-15th century. The researchers collected samples, sent them to a radiocarbon dating lab, and waited. The results came back 1440 CE, plus or minus 30 years, which should have been perfect. That date aligns precisely with the reign of Pachacuti, the Inca emperor credited with commissioning Machu Picchu. Except the charcoal wasn't from a hearth. It wasn't from a campfire. It was from a burned layer evidence of something larger. A clearing event, perhaps, or a destruction event. Something that required enough heat to leave a signature in the soil, a scar that the builders then covered over when they began their work. And in another excavation, deeper still, more charcoal. Older charcoal. Centuries older, according to the lab results. The mainstream interpretation is straightforward. The site was occupied before the Inca arrived. Hunter-gatherers, perhaps, or farmers from one of the smaller Andean cultures that predated the empire. They cleared the ridge, burned the vegetation, used the land for a time, and moved on. When Pachacuti's architects arrived, they simply built over the remnants. A logical explanation, tidy, uncontroversial, but it raises a question. Why here? Machu Picchu is not an easy place to live. The ridge is narrow, the slopes are steep, and the nearest arable land is down in the valley, hours away by foot. There are dozens of locations in the region that would have been more practical for a settlement lower, flatter, closer to water and food. So why did someone centuries before the Inca choose this particular ridge? One possibility: it was already sacred. Mountains were not mere geography to Andean peoples. They were living beings apis, spirits that watched over the land, that controlled the weather, that decided who prospered and who starved. Certain peaks were considered more powerful than others, and the places where multiple peaks aligned, where rivers converged, where the geography itself seemed to focus energy, were treated as access points, thresholds between the human world and the divine. Machu Picchu sits at one such threshold. It is surrounded by mountains on all sides. Huayna Picchu to the north, Machu Picchu Mountain to the south, Pachacuti to the east. The Urubamba River loops around the ridge in a near-perfect horseshoe, a natural moat that ancient cosmologies might have interpreted as a protective barrier or a symbolic boundary. If the ridge was considered sacred before the Inca Empire even existed, then the early burn layers take on a different meaning. Not evidence of casual occupation, but of ritual. Fires lit as offerings, clearings made for ceremony. Stones placed perhaps in patterns that no longer survive, alignments that the Inca later incorporated into their own designs. Another possibility: the ash is evidence of disaster. Volcanic activity? Unlikely. There are no volcanoes close enough to leave deposits at Machu Picchu. Lightning strikes? Possible, but repeated burns suggest intentionality. War? Also possible. The pre-Inca Andes were not a peaceful place. Cultures rose and fell, fought for territory, raised each other's settlements. And this is the possibility that keeps appearing in fringe theories, the one that mainstream scholars dismiss but cannot entirely disprove. The ash is evidence of an earlier attempt to build here, an attempt that failed, an attempt that ended in fire and was then buried deliberately before the Inca started fresh. Who burns a construction site? Who goes to the trouble of clearing a mountaintop, begins to build, and then destroys their own work? Unless the builders realized something, found something, decided that the ridge was not ready, or that they were not ready, or that the stones themselves had other plans. The charcoal offers no further clues. It simply sits in the archives, dated and catalogued, a footnote in a story that most historians consider already written. But footnotes have a way of becoming chapters, given enough time. The consensus is clear, supported by decades of excavation and analysis. Machu Picchu was built around 1450 CE as a royal estate for Pachacuti Inca, Yupanqui, the ninth ruler of Cusco, and the emperor who transformed a regional kingdom into the largest empire the Americas had ever seen. Pachacuti's name means earthshaker, was a military genius, a political visionary, and, by all accounts, a man who understood the power of symbols. Under his rule, the Inca expanded from the Cusco Valley to control territories stretching from modern-day Ecuador to Chile, a dominion held together by roads, by force, and by an ideology that framed the emperor not as a mere king, but as a divine intermediary between humanity and the cosmos. He did not simply conquer, he rebuilt. He redesigned Cusco itself, transforming it into a sacred capital whose very layout mirrored the heavens. He commissioned temples, fortresses, agricultural terraces, and estates that demonstrated Inca mastery over landscape and stone. Machu Picchu fits this pattern perfectly. It is not a city in the conventional sense. No sprawling population, number markets, no evidence of large-scale residential occupation. Instead, it functions as a royal retreat, a place where the emperor and his court could withdraw from the political pressures of Cusco, where priests could conduct ceremonies away from public eyes, where the elite could commune with the sacred peaks and the gods who dwelled within them. The evidence is strong. Pottery shards found throughout the site are of a style known as Inca Imperial high-quality ceramics produced in Cusco and used almost exclusively by the nobility. The architecture follows canonical Inca design principles: trapezoidal doorways, finely fitted stonework, temples aligned to celestial events. Skeletal remains recovered from burial sites around Machu Picchu include a high proportion of women, many of whom show signs of having been dedicated to religious service class, or chosen women who lived in seclusion, weaving textiles for the gods, brewing sacred chicha, and maintaining the temples. There are also the remains of artisans, stoneworkers, potters, weavers. Not warriors, not bureaucrats. This was not a military installation or an administrative center. It was a place of ritual, of craft, of elite withdrawal. And then there is the landscape itself. Pachacuti's architects did not simply build on the ridge, they transformed it. They carved terraces into the slopes, stabilized the soil, redirected natural springs into a sophisticated water distribution system that fed 16 ritual fountains, each one flowing into the next in a deliberate sequence that may have symbolized purification, or the movement of water from the celestial realm to the earthly one. They shaped the very bones of the mountain to align with sacred geography. The Intihuatana stone, for example, stands at the highest point of the urban sector, positioned so that its shadow marks the solstices and equinoxes. From this stone, you can see Salcantay to the southwest, one of the most powerful apis in the Inca cosmology, and Veronica to the northeast, another sacred peak. Everything at Machu Picchu is intentional. Nothing is accidental. The mainstream narrative, then, is one of imperial grandeur and religious devotion. Pachacuti, at the height of his power, chose this ridge because it was remote, because it was beautiful, because it allowed him to be close to the gods and far from the noise of empire. He commanded the labor of thousands of workers rotating in shifts as part of the Mita system, the mandatory public service that all Inca subjects owed to the state, and in the span of a few decades, they built a masterpiece. When Pachacuti died, Machu Picchu passed to his descendants. It remained in use for perhaps 50 to 70 years, until the Spanish conquest shattered the empire, and the royal estates were abandoned, their inhabitants fleeing into the jungle or absorbed into the colonial order. The jungle reclaimed the ridge, the terraces grew wild, the fountains dried up, and for nearly 4 centuries, Machu Picchu slept, forgotten by everyone except the farmers who lived in its shadow. This is the story taught in textbooks, displayed in museums, repeated by tour guides who lead thousands of visitors up the steep path each day. It is a good story, elegant, supported by evidence. But it is not the only story. Step outside the orthodoxy for a moment, and another Machu Picchu emerges, one that is older, stranger, and far more deliberate in its relationship to the cosmos. What if Pachacuti did not choose this ridge arbitrarily? What if he chose it because it had already been chosen, long before his empire existed, by people who understood something about the land that we have since forgotten? There is a concept in Andean cosmology called sec lines of spiritual energy that radiate out from sacred centers, connecting temples, shrines, springs, and mountains in a vast, invisible web. Cusco, the Inca capital, was the heart of this system, with 41 sec lines extending in all directions, each one maintained by specific clans who were responsible for the rituals conducted at sites along the line. But sec lines did not begin with the Inca. They existed before the empire, woven into the landscape by cultures whose names we no longer know. And some researchers believe that Machu Picchu sits at the intersection of multiple sec, a node point where spiritual currents converge. Consider the water. 16 fountains flow in sequence through the urban sector, fed by a single spring located high on the mountain. But the spring itself is unusual. It never runs dry, even during droughts that devastate the valley below. In a region where water is seasonal and unpredictable, this is remarkable. It suggests that the spring taps into a deep aquifer, a subterranean river that flows year-round beneath the ridge. To the Inca, water was not merely a resource. It was a living force, a manifestation of the divine. Springs were sacred, considered to be the veins of Pachamama, the Earth Mother. To build a city around a perpetual spring was to build a city at the very heart of the world as life force. The fountains themselves are ritualized. They are not simple spouts. They are carved, shaped, positioned so that the water flows in specific ways, creating sounds, creating patterns. To move through the fountains in sequence is to undergo a symbolic purification, a journey from lower to higher states of being. And then there are the sightlines. Stand at the Temple of the Sun and look south. You see Salcante, the snow-capped guardian of the region. Turn east. Pachacuti rises like a jagged tooth against the sky. Look north. Machu Picchu, the young peak, looms directly overhead. Machu Picchu does not simply sit in the mountains. It watches them, it mirrors them. It engages with them in a dialogue of stone and space that suggests the city was designed not as a human habitation, but as a terrestrial reflection of celestial order. Some researchers go further. They propose that Machu Picchu was an initiation site, a place where Inca nobles underwent spiritual training, where priests learned to read the stars and the stones, where the boundary between the physical and the metaphysical was deliberately thinned. There are structures within the complex that support this idea. The Temple of the Condor, for example, is built around a natural rock formation that resembles the head and outstretched wings of a condor, a bird sacred to the Inca associated with the upper world, the realm of the sun and the ancestors. The wings are carved into the floor of the temple, while the head rises from the stone itself, as if the bird were emerging from the earth. Why build a temple around a rock that already looks like a sacred animal? Unless the rock was sacred first. Unless the shape came before the city, and the city was built to honor it. This is the alternative history of Machu Picchu, that it was not constructed, but discovered. That Pachacuti's architects did not impose order on a blank ridge, but recognized order that was already there encoded in the topography, in the flow of water, in the alignment of peaks, and built accordingly. If this is true, then the question shifts. It is no longer, why did the Inca build Machu Picchu? It is, who taught them where to build it? At the highest point of the urban sector, on a carved granite platform that overlooks the entire complex, stands a stone unlike any other in Machu Picchu. It is waist-high, roughly rectangular, but its surfaces are anything but flat. Angles and facets have been cut into the rock with obsessive precision, creating a geometric form that seems almost crystalline. 4 corners jut outward, oriented to the cardinal directions. The top surface slopes and steps in ways that defy casual explanation. This is the Intihuatana, the hitching post of the sun. The name comes from colonial-era Spanish chroniclers who recorded Inca rituals, in which priests symbolically tied the sun to the stone during the winter solstice. ensuring that it would not continue its retreat southward and plunge the world into eternal darkness. Whether the ritual was literal or metaphorical is unclear. What is clear is that the Intihuatana is an astronomical instrument. On June 21st, the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere, the sun at its highest point casts almost no shadow from the stone. The geometry is exact. Whoever carved this stone understood not only the solstice, but the latitude, the angle of the sun's path across the sky, and how to translate that understanding into granite. Archaeoastronomers have documented dozens of similar alignments throughout Machu Picchu. The Temple of the Sun's windows frame the June solstice sunrise and the December solstice sunset. The sacred plaza aligns with the rising of the Pleiades. Even the agricultural terraces follow angles that may correspond to celestial patterns, as if the entire city were designed to echo the heavens. This is not controversial. The Inca were master astronomers, and their calendar was essential to their survival. Agriculture, ritual, governance all depended on precise timekeeping. Building celestial alignments into their architecture was practical, religious, and politically strategic. But there are aspects of the Intihuatana that push beyond the orthodox. For one, the stone is carved from the living bedrock. It was not placed on the platform. It is the platform, sculpted directly from the ridge itself. Why go to such lengths? Why not simply shape a movable stone and position it accordingly? Unless the location mattered. Unless this specific spot, this exact point on the ridge, was considered uniquely powerful. And then there is the stone's complexity. The facets and angles are not random, but they are also not entirely explained by solar alignments alone. Some researchers have proposed that the Intihuatana tracked not just the sun, but the moon, the planets, even specific stars. That it was a multifunction instrument, a stone computer encoding astronomical data in three-dimensional form. Others go further still, into territory that makes academic archaeologists uncomfortable. There is a recurring claim in alternative history circles that the Intihuatana and stones, like it found at other Inca sites, was not merely an observational tool, but a device. That it focused energy, that it resonated with frequencies beyond the visible spectrum, that it served functions we have forgotten how to recognize. Quartz. The stone is granite, and granite contains quartz, a mineral that exhibits piezoelectric properties. It generates a small electrical charge when subjected to pressure. Could the Inca have known this? Could they have used it? No evidence supports this. No experiments have detected anomalous energy fields around the Intihuatana. And yet the idea persists, fueled by the stone's undeniable strangeness, by the feeling reported by visitors for over a century that standing near the Intihuatana is different, quieter, more focused, as if the air itself listens. Mainstream science dismisses this as psychological projection, the result of expectation and suggestion. Stand in a sacred space, and you will feel something sacred. But perhaps the Inca understood psychology better than we give them credit for. Perhaps they knew that a stone, properly shaped and properly placed, could alter perception, could create a mental state conducive to revelation. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the stone breathes light for reasons we have not yet learned to measure. The Spanish understood something about the Intihuatana, though. They destroyed almost everyone they found. Throughout the Inca Empire, these carved stones were smashed, toppled, obliterated as part of the campaign to erase indigenous religion and replace it with Christianity. The Intihuatana at Machu Picchu survived only because the Spanish never reached the site. It remains intact, still casting its precise shadows, still marking the solstices, still waiting for someone to fully understand what it was meant to do. On the western edge of the urban sector, carved into the steep slope that drops away toward the river, there is a staircase. It is beautifully made. Each step is cut from solid granite, fitted seamlessly into the hillside. The craftsmanship is identical to the rest of Machu Picchu, precise, durable, built to last centuries. But it does not lead anywhere. 30 steps descend the slope, and then, abruptly, the staircase ends. No landing, no platform. Just a final step that opens onto a sheer drop, as if the builders simply stopped mid-construction and never returned. Tour guides offer a practical explanation. The staircase was never finished. Perhaps the architects changed their plans. Perhaps they realized the slope was too unstable, or that the route would require more labor than they could afford. Construction halted, and the unfinished stairway was left as is, forgotten in the larger work of completing the city. But this explanation has problems. First, the staircase is not rough or incomplete in its execution. Every step is fully carved, fully polished. If the project had been abandoned mid-work, you would expect to find half-finished stones, tool marks, rubble. There are none. Second, there are other examples of this phenomenon at Machu Picchu doorways that open onto blank walls, corridors that narrow into dead ends, niches carved into stone and then sealed over. It is as if the city contains deliberate discontinuities, architectural sentences that trail off into silence. Why? One theory: the incomplete elements are symbolic. In Andean cosmology, incompleteness was not a flaw, it was an acknowledgement of the sacred. To finish something entirely was to claim perfection, a domain reserved for the gods. Leaving elements unfinished was an act of humility, a way of saying, we are still becoming. Another theory: the staircase was functional, but not in the way we assume. Perhaps it led to a wooden platform that has since decayed. Perhaps it was used for rituals that required symbolic descent into the underworld, into the realm of the ancestors, without requiring actual physical passage. Or perhaps it was a test, a trial for initiates, who were expected to walk down the staircase and at the final step, leap. Into what? The void? Another staircase, hidden from view? There are legends among the local Quechua-speaking communities, passed down through generations, of hidden paths within Machu Picchu, secret routes that only the priests knew, passages that opened during certain times of the year, doorways that could be seen only by those who had undergone the proper rituals. Most archaeologists dismiss these stories as folklore, embellishments added over time to make the site more mysterious. But the unfinished staircase suggests otherwise. It suggests that Machu Picchu may have had layers of access, visible and invisible, that not everyone who walked through the city was meant to see everything it contained. Or there is a simpler, stranger explanation. The staircase was never meant to be walked. It was meant to be seen. From a distance, perhaps. From a specific vantage point, where the staircase aligns with a peak, or a star, or another structure, creating a visual connection that encoded meaning in geometry rather than function. This is not as far-fetched as it sounds. The Nazca lines, hundreds of miles to the south, are enormous geoglyphs, images carved into the desert floor that can only be fully appreciated from the air. Why make something that cannot be seen from the ground unless visibility was never the point? The stairway that leads nowhere remains one of Machu Picchu's quiet mysteries. It is not dramatic enough to attract much attention, not strange enough to generate headlines. It simply sits there, descending into emptiness, waiting for someone to understand what it descends into. There is a saying among engineers: anyone can build on flat ground. Machu Picchu is not flat ground. The ridge on which the city sits is less than a mile long and barely a quarter-mile wide at its widest point. The slopes on either side plunge downward at angles that range from steep to suicidal. The soil is thin, underlaid by fractured granite that shifts with every rainstorm, every tremor, every century of weathering. By all logic, this should have been an impossible place to build. And yet the Inca not only built here, they thrived. They created an urban complex that has withstood 500 years of earthquakes, landslides, and tropical deluges without collapsing into the valley below. The key is the terraces. To the casual observer, terraces look simple, stacked layers of stone holding back soil, allowing crops to grow on slopes that would otherwise be barren. But Machu Picchu's terraces are feats of geotechnical engineering that rival anything produced by modern civil engineers. Start with the foundation. The Inca did not simply pile stones against the hillside and hope for the best. They excavated deeply, sometimes removing 10 or 15 feet of unstable soil to reach bedrock. Then they built upward in layers, large boulders at the base for stability, smaller stones above, gravel for drainage, and finally, a deep layer of topsoil, often imported from the valley below, on which crops could grow. The result is a system that self-drains. Rainwater percolates through the soil and gravel, flows down through the stone layers, and exits through carefully placed weep holes in the terrace walls, preventing the buildup of hydrostatic pressure that would otherwise cause the terraces to bulge and collapse. This is not intuitive knowledge. It requires observation, experimentation, and an understanding of physics that would not be formally codified in Western science until the 19th century. The Inca understood it 500 years earlier. And then there is the water management. Machu Picchu receives heavy rainfall, especially during the wet season. Without proper drainage, the city would have turned into a muddy ruin within years. But the Inca engineered a comprehensive drainage system, channels carved into stone, culverts running beneath plazas, a network of underground conduits that divert water away from foundations and into the river far below. Modern studies using ground-penetrating radar have revealed that nearly 60% of Machu Picchu's construction is underground invisible infrastructure that keeps the visible city stable. This is not the work of a culture that stumbled onto a solution. This is the work of a culture that had perfected the solution over generations, possibly centuries, of building in the Andes. But where did they learn? The orthodox answer is trial and error. The Inca inherited knowledge from earlier Andean civilizations, the Tiwanaku, the Wari, and refined it through their own imperial projects. By the time they reached Machu Picchu, they were masters of mountain construction. But there are anomalies. Some of the terrace walls display the same polygonal stonework found in the temple's blocks, weighing several tons, shaped into irregular forms, fitted together without mortar. Why use such labor-intensive techniques for agricultural terraces? Why not save the precision work for the sacred structures and use simpler methods for the fields? Unless the terraces were sacred too. There is a concept in Andean thought that the land itself is alive, that soil is not mere dirt, but the flesh of Pachamama, the Earth Mother. To shape the land, to carve terraces into her body, was a ritual act, not merely a practical one. The terraces at Machu Picchu may have been designed not only to grow maize and potatoes, but to honor the mountain, to create a sacred dialogue between human need and terrestrial power. And there is another possibility, one that edges into speculation, that some of the terrace foundations predate the Inca. Excavations have occasionally revealed older stonework beneath, Inca construction walls that do not match Inca style, pottery shards that belong to earlier cultures. If the ridge was occupied before Pachacuti, it is possible that the earliest terraces were built by those earlier inhabitants, and that the Inca simply expanded and refined what was already there. Which raises a question. If the terraces are older, how much older? And who, in the deep past of the Andes, understood geotechnical engineering well enough to stabilize a ridge that should, by all rights, have slid into the river long ago? In 2011, exactly 100 years after Hiram Bingham's arrival, a team of French engineers brought ground-penetrating radar equipment to Machu Picchu. Their goal was not treasure hunting or wild speculation. It was structural assessment, an effort to map the city's underground drainage and foundation systems to aid in preservation efforts. But the radar detected something unexpected: voids, chambers beneath the Temple of the Sun, cavities under the sacred plaza, tunnels that seemed to run beneath residential sectors, following no visible logic, leading nowhere that modern eyes could see. The findings were published quietly in technical reports that received little public attention. The Peruvian government, which tightly controls all research at Machu Picchu, did not authorize excavation. The voids remain unexplored. Officially, the explanation is conservative. The voids are natural fissures in the bedrock, or collapsed drainage channels, or gaps left by the original construction process. Nothing unusual. Nothing that demands investigation. But the radar data suggests otherwise. Some of the voids are too regular to be natural. They have walls. They have ceilings. They have the signature of intentional construction. This should not be surprising. The Inca were known to build subterranean chambers, particularly in association with temples. At Sacsayhuaman, the massive fortress overlooking Cusco, there are labyrinthine tunnels beneath the surface chincanas. They are called places where initiates underwent trials in darkness, where offerings were left for the spirits of the underworld. Machu Picchu, if it was a sacred site, would logically have similar features. But no one knows for certain, because no one has been allowed to look. The reluctance to excavate is understandable. Machu Picchu is fragile, both physically and politically. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a symbol of Peruvian national identity, and one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. Any invasive research risks damage, and damage invites international condemnation. But the reluctance also fuels speculation. What if the chambers contain burials? Not ordinary burials, but royal tombs, perhaps even the tomb of Pachacuti himself, whose mummy was taken by the Spanish and lost to history. Finding such a tomb would rewrite Inca history, but it would also raise ethical questions about how to handle sacred remains. What if the chambers contain caches of artifacts? Gold, ceramics, textiles objects that were deliberately hidden, either to protect them from looters or because they were too sacred to leave exposed. Or, and this is where speculation edges into fantasy, what if the chambers contain records? The Inca did not have writing in the conventional sense. They used quipus, knotted cords, that encoded information in a tactile, geometric language that we still cannot fully decipher. Most quipus were made of organic materials and have not survived. But what if some were stored underground, in sealed chambers where humidity and decay could not reach them? What stories would they tell? The alternative history community, predictably, has its own theories. Some believe the chambers connect to a larger network of tunnels running beneath the entire Inca Empire, secret passages used by priests and kings to travel unseen. Others suggest the voids are evidence of an older civilization, pre-Inca builders who hollowed out the mountain for purposes we can only guess at. There is no evidence for any of this, but there is also no evidence against it, because the chambers remain sealed, the radar images tantalizingly incomplete, the questions unanswered. Meanwhile, tourists walk above, unaware that beneath their feet, the mountain holds its breath. Machu Picchu did not exist in isolation. It was a node in a vast, interconnected system, a single jewel in a crown that stretched across the spine of South America. The Capac-On, the great Inca road, was the circulatory system of the empire. At its height, it spanned over 25,000 miles, weaving through deserts, over mountain passes, across suspension bridges that swayed above gorges so deep that the rivers below could not be heard. The road was not a single route, but a network of coastal highways running parallel to the Pacific, highland routes threading through the Andes, lateral paths connecting the two. Along these roads moved armies, administrators, messengers, and the endless stream of goods and tribute that flowed toward Cusco. Gold from the north, silver from the south, coca leaves and canoa dried fish, woven textiles, ceramics, and the mummies of ancestors carried in procession to sacred festivals. There were way stations every few miles, tambos, small complexes where travelers could rest, where food was stored, where fresh relay runners waited to carry messages to the next station. The Chasqui, these runners, could deliver news from Quito to Cusco over 1,000 miles in less than a week, faster than any communication system in Europe at the time. Machu Picchu connects to this network via a trail that descends from the ridge, crosses the Urubamba River, and joins the main road leading northeast into the Amazon basin and southwest back to Cusco. But the trail to Machu Picchu is not a major artery. It is a side branch, narrow and steep, the kind of route that signals this place is not for everyone. The mainstream interpretation is that Machu Picchu served as a frontier outpost, a place where the highland Inca could maintain a presence near the edge of the jungle, where lowland resources, coca, tropical fruits, exotic feathers could be accessed and controlled. It also served a strategic function. The Urubamba Valley was contested territory, home to groups that resisted Inca expansion. Machu Picchu, perched high above the river, would have been a defensible position, a place from which to monitor movement through the valley and project imperial power. But there is a problem with this interpretation. Machu Picchu shows no signs of military occupation. There are no barracks, no weapons caches, no fortifications designed to withstand siege. The site is elegant, ceremonial, peaceful. If it was a fortress, it was the strangest fortress the Inca ever built. More likely, Machu Picchu was a stopping point on a pilgrimage route. The Inca conducted pilgrimages to sacred mountains Osanget, Salcante, Vilcabamba journeys that could take weeks and involved ritual offerings, fasting, and ceremonies at high-altitude shrines. Machu Picchu, with its temples, its fountains, its view of Salcante, fits perfectly into this framework. It was a place to pause, to purify, to prepare for the deeper journey into the mountains. The road, then, was not merely a route. It was a ritual in itself, each step a prayer, each tambo a threshold between the ordinary world and the sacred one. And if Machu Picchu was a threshold, then the question becomes, what lay on the other side? Imagine walking the Inca road 500 years after the empire's collapse. The stone paving is still intact in places, but most of it has been overtaken by vegetation. Trees grow through the plazas of abandoned jambos. Suspension bridges have rotted away, leaving only the stone anchors embedded in canyon walls. Now imagine walking the same path 1,000 years earlier, before the Inca existed. Would you find a road? The answer, according to some researchers, is yes. There is growing evidence that the Capac Ome was not entirely an Inca creation. In many places, the Inca roads follow routes that were already their footpaths worn smooth by centuries of use, trails that connected villages long before those villages were absorbed into an empire. The Inca formalized these routes. They widened them, paved them, made them uniform. But they did not invent them. This is important because it suggests that the logic of the road network, the choice of which valleys to traverse, which mountain passes to cross, was not purely strategic or economic. It was cultural, even cosmological, following pathways that had been established by people whose worldviews shaped the landscape long before the empire. And if the roads are older, then the places they connect might be older too. There are legends in the Andes of the Wari, a pre-Inca civilization that built cities and roads across the highlands between 600 and 1000 CE. The Wari left behind ruins, massive stone complexes, agricultural terraces, burial towers, but much of their culture remains mysterious. Their language is unknown. Their political structure is debated. Even their collapse is a matter of speculation. Drought, war, social upheaval, or some combination of all three. What if the Wari knew about Machu Picchu? What if they built there first, and the Inca discovered their ruins and built atop them, just as they incorporated Wari roads into the Capac Ome? There is no direct evidence for this. No Wari pottery has been found at Machu Picchu. No inscriptions, no skeletal remains that carbon date to the Wari period. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially at a site where only a fraction of the area has been excavated. And then there are the local stories, oral traditions passed down through Quechua-speaking communities, stories that predate written history, stories that speak of the old ones who lived in the mountains before the Inca, who built with stones so large that no human could lift them, who vanished when the gods called them back into the earth. Some anthropologists dismiss these stories as myth, cultural memories distorted by time, but others take them seriously, recognizing that oral traditions often preserve kernels of historical truth, encoded in metaphor and narrative. If the old ones existed, they were not gods. They were people earlier Andean cultures, whose achievements were later attributed to supernatural forces, because no other explanation seemed sufficient. But who were they? And what did they know? One possibility: the Chachapoya, the cloud people, who lived in the northern Andes and built cliffside cities that cling to mountainsides in ways that seem architecturally impossible. The Chachapoya were conquered by the Inca in the 15th century, but their culture dates back much earlier. Could they have ranged as far south as Machu Picchu? Could their knowledge of high-altitude construction have influenced Inca builders? Another possibility: a culture we have not yet identified, whose ruins are still buried, whose name has been lost, whose roads lie beneath the roads we walk today. The Andes are vast. Much of the terrain is inaccessible, covered in jungle or ice. New sites are discovered regularly, sometimes by archaeologists, more often by farmers or hikers who stumble onto walls emerging from the undergrowth. How many more are waiting? And how many of them, like Machu Picchu, sit at the intersection of roads that were old even when the Inca walked them? The jungle does not care about history. It grows over empires with the same indifference it shows to fallen trees. Stone walls become scaffolding for vines. Plazas become gardens of ferns and moss. Roofs collapse, and within a generation, the forest has reclaimed what took centuries to build. This is not slow decay. This is aggressive, purposeful erasure, as if the jungle itself has a memory and resents the intrusion of cities. Machu Picchu sits on the edge of the cloud forest, a transitional zone where the high Andes descend into the Amazon basin. The climate is humid, the rainfall relentless during the wet season. Without constant maintenance, clearing vegetation, repairing drainage, patching wall structures here succumb quickly. This is why Machu Picchu was nearly invisible when Bingham arrived. It had been abandoned for less than 400 years, and already the jungle had wrapped it in a cocoon of green, concealing terraces, filling courtyards with soil and roots, transforming temples into something that looked more like natural rock formations than human architecture. How long does it take for a city to disappear? The answer depends on the jungle. In wetter, lower altitude regions, where the Amazon proper begins complete erasure, can happen in under a century. Wooden structures rot away within decades. Stone is slower, but not immune. Tree roots crack foundations. Moisture dissolves mortar. Earthquakes accelerate the process, toppling walls that the jungle then digests at its leisure. There are stories in the Amazon of lost cities, rumors passed down through indigenous communities, tales of stone ruins deep in the forest, places that no outsider has ever seen. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as fantasy, the result of colonial-era Europeans projecting their desires for El Dorado onto a landscape they did not understand. But then, in the 1990s and 2000s, archaeologists using satellite imagery and LiDAR laser-based remote sensing began finding them. Vast earthworks in the Bolivian Amazon, geometric patterns carved into the forest floor, visible only from above. Roads connecting settlements that had been abandoned centuries before Europeans arrived. These were not small villages. They were complex societies, possibly numbering in the hundreds of thousands, supported by advanced agriculture, trade networks, and monumental construction. And then they vanished. The collapse is usually attributed to disease, smallpox, measles, and other pathogens brought by Spanish conquistadors, which spread faster than the conquistadors themselves, decimating populations before European boots ever touched Amazonian soil. But disease is not the whole story. Climate shifts, warfare, resource depletion, any of these could have contributed. And once a city is abandoned, once the maintenance stops, the jungle finishes the job. How many Andean sites have suffered the same fate? How many Machu Picchus are still out there, buried under centuries of growth, waiting for a LiDAR scan or a lucky hiker to reveal them? The cloud forest offers no answers. It only grows, patient and relentless, a green amnesia swallowing everything it touches. And the farmers who lived in the valley had no reason to reveal it. Why invite conquest? There is another, more speculative theory, that Machu Picchu was evacuated peacefully, that its inhabitants were recalled before the Spanish arrived, and that the lack of weapons reflects a deliberate choice to preserve the site as a sacred, non-violent space. If true, this would suggest that the Inca understood something we often forget, that some places are too important to fight for, because fighting would destroy the very thing you are trying to protect. Or perhaps the skeletons simply reflect what Machu Picchu always was: a sanctuary, a place of craftsmanship and prayer, a city where swords were not welcome, because they had no purpose in a world built entirely for gods. Long before Pachacuti carved his name into history, the Andes were already a landscape of power. The Tiwanaku civilization flourished near Lake Titicaca between 300 and 1000 CE, building stone cities at altitudes where the air is so thin that exertion feels like drowning. Their capital, Puma Punku, contains blocks weighing over 100 tons, cut with such precision that they fit together like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle. Some of these blocks show tool marks that do not match any known Andean technology: straight, parallel grooves that look almost machined. Who were the Tiwanaku? We do not know. Their language is lost. Their political structure is speculative. Even their collapse is a mystery, though climate data suggests a prolonged drought may have destabilized their agricultural base. Further north, the Wari built an empire before the Inca did, controlling much of the highland and coastal regions, Between 600 and 1000 CE, they built roads, storage facilities, administrative centers. They influenced Inca architecture, Inca pottery, possibly even Inca cosmology. But the Wari left no writing, and their cities are crumbling ruins, their stories fragmentary. And before the Wari, there were others. The Xevin, whose temple at Xevin de Honter contains underground galleries and carved stone heads depicting jaguars, serpents, and beings that seem half human, half divine. The Paracas, whose textiles are among the finest ever woven, whose skulls were deliberately elongated in a practice that spanned centuries. The Nazca, who carved enormous geoglyphs into the desert, a hummingbird, a spider, a monkey, images so large they can only be seen from the sky. Why make images that cannot be seen from the ground? This is not idle speculation. There are documented cases of the Inca incorporating pre-existing sacred sites into their own religious landscapes. The Island of the Sun in Lake Titicaca, for example, was a pilgrimage destination long before the Inca Empire existed. The Inca claimed it, built temples there, but they did not erase its earlier significance. They layered their own meanings atop it. Machu Picchu may be the same. A palimpsest, a place where histories overlap, where the stones remember more than one set of hands. The Inca did not see the sky as separate from the earth. They saw it as a mirror, a reflection, a second landscape that moved in harmony with the first. This is the principle of any reciprocity, balance. What happens above must be echoed below. What is sacred in the heavens must be honored on the ground. And so they built accordingly. Machu Picchu is full of windows, but they are not random. The Temple of the Sun's eastern window aligns with the June solstice sunrise. On that morning, light enters the sea temple and strikes the sacred stone at its center, marking the moment when the sun reaches its southernmost point and begins its journey back north. The western window aligns with the December solstice sunset, the moment when the sun reverses its northern retreat and begins its return south. These alignments are not accidental. They required precise observation, careful calculation, and an understanding of the sun's path across the sky that would have taken generations to perfect. But the solstices are only the beginning. The Intimache cave, carved into the rock on the eastern edge of the city, contains a window that frames the December solstice sunrise in a way that suggests it was used as a ceremonial observatory. On that morning, light floods the cave, illuminating carvings that are otherwise hidden in shadow. The sacred plaza at the heart of the urban sector is oriented to the rising of the Pleiades, a star cluster that the Inca called Colca, the storehouse, because its appearance in the night sky signaled the beginning of the agricultural year. When Colca rose in late October, it was time to plant. When it disappeared in April, it was time to harvest. Even the terraces may encode celestial information. Some researchers have noted that the angles of certain terrace walls correspond to the inclination of the Milky Way as it appears in the southern hemisphere, a river of stars that the Inca saw as a reflection of the Urubamba River below. If this is true, then walking through Machu Picchu is not just walking through a city. It is walking through the cosmos, tracing the paths of gods and stars made manifest in stone and soil. But there are stranger alignments, ones that edge into controversial territory. Glaciers advance and retreat. The Inca built their empire during what was, climatically speaking, a golden age. And then abandoned during the megadrought, only to be rediscovered and rebuilt by the Inca centuries later? This would explain some of the site's anomalies, the older charcoal layers, the polygonal stonework that resembles Tiwanaku techniques, the sense that parts of Machu Picchu feel archaeologically layered, as if the city has been built, abandoned, and rebuilt more than once. Ice core samples from Andean glaciers provide a climate record stretching back thousands of years. These cores show periods of rapid change, sudden cooling, sudden warming, droughts that coincide with the collapse of major cultures. If Machu Picchu sits at a climatically significant location, near a perennial spring, in a zone where rainfall is more stable than in surrounding regions, it would have been a valuable site during periods of climate stress. A place to retreat to when the lowlands dried up, when the highlands became uninhabitable. And if that is true, then Machu Picchu is not just an Inca creation. It is a refuge, a place that has been rediscovered and reoccupied multiple times across deep history, each culture adding its own layer, its own interpretation, its own memory. The stones remember. They remember ice and drought and the slow return of rain. They remember footsteps that predate the empire, voices that spoke languages no longer recorded. And they wait, as stones do, for the climate to shift again, for the next cycle to begin, for the ridge to prove once more that some places are sacred not because of who built them, but because of what they endure. Sometime in the late 16th century, Machu Picchu was abandoned, not destroyed, not sacked, not burned, simply left. The terraces remained intact. The temples stood undamaged. The fountains still trickled water through their stone channels. But the people were gone. Why? The mainstream explanation points to the Spanish conquest. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro and his conquistadors captured the Inca emperor Atahualpa, executed him, and began the systematic dismantling of the empire. The Inca nobility was hunted, their royal estates confiscated, their religious sites destroyed. But the Spanish never reached Machu Picchu. The site was too remote, too well hidden. It is not mentioned in any colonial records, not marked on any Spanish maps. So if the Spanish did not drive the inhabitants out, what did? One theory: resource depletion. Machu Picchu required constant maintenance, clearing terraces, repairing walls, managing water systems. It also required a steady supply of food, much of which had to be carried up from the valley. If the labor force was redirected to support the war effort against the Spanish, or if the agricultural base collapsed due to disease or social upheaval, the site would have become unsustainable. Another theory: political collapse. Machu Picchu was likely tied to a specific royal lineage Pachacuti's descendants, who maintained the estate as part of their inherited wealth. When the Spanish disrupted the Inca political system, these lineages lost power and their estates were abandoned. A third theory: intentional evacuation. If the inhabitants of Machu Picchu knew the Spanish were coming, they may have chosen to leave, taking with them anything portable textiles, ceramics, gold, and sealing the site behind them. This would explain the lack of valuable artifacts found during excavations. The city was not looted. It was emptied deliberately by people who understood that some places are safer abandoned than occupied. But there is a more speculative possibility, one that appears in local legends and oral traditions, that Machu Picchu was not abandoned because of external threats, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. If the city was a sacred site, a place of initiation and ritual, then perhaps it was only ever meant to be occupied temporarily. Perhaps the inhabitants came, performed their ceremonies, and then left not in flight, but in completion. This would fit with the site's lack of defensive structures, its small population, its sense of being a place apart from the world. It was not a city in the conventional sense. It was a threshold, a passage, a place you entered for a time and then moved beyond. And if that is true, then the abandonment was not a tragedy. It was a conclusion. The stones bear no trauma. The walls show no signs of haste. The terraces are neat, as if the last person to walk them took care to leave them tidy. Machu Picchu was not fled. It was released. In 1913, 2 years after Bingham's initial expedition, excavators working in a burial cave near Machu Picchu uncovered a mummy wrapped in white cloth. This alone was unusual. Most Inca burial textiles were dyed reds, blues, yellows colors that denoted status, lineage, and religious affiliation. White cloth was rare, reserved for specific rituals, specific individuals. But stranger still was the weave. The fabric was finer than anything else found at the site. The thread count was extraordinary, approaching the quality of the finest Paracas textiles from the coast, a culture that predated the Inca by centuries and was renowned for weaving techniques that modern technology struggles to replicate. How did a woman buried in Machu Picchu come to be wrapped in cloth that resembled Paracas work? Trade is one possibility. The Inca Empire spanned thousands of miles, and goods moved along the road network from coast to highlands to jungle. A piece of cloth from the south coast could have traveled north, been treasured, been kept for generations before finally being used in a burial. But there is another possibility, that the cloth was not made by the Paracas, but by someone who knew their techniques. That Machu Picchu hosted weavers trained in ancient methods, people who preserved knowledge that had otherwise been lost. The Inca valued memory. They had no writing, but they had quipus, oral traditions, and objects, textiles, ceramics, carved stones that served as mnemonic devices, containers for stories and histories. If the woman in white cloth was a keeper of such memories, then her burial was not just an end. It was a transmission, a way of ensuring that the knowledge she carried would remain, encoded in the fabric that wrapped her, waiting for someone to recognize its significance. The mummy itself has been lost. It was taken to Yale, along with thousands of other artifacts, stored in collections that were not returned to Peru until the 21st century. And by then, the records were incomplete, the provenance uncertain. But the cloth, if it still exists somewhere, might still tell its story, might still hold in its threads a connection to cultures older than the empire, older than the roads, older than the names we use to make sense of the past. At dawn, when the mist rises and the sun has not yet burned through, Machu Picchu becomes something else, not a ruin, not a tourist destination, not even a city, exactly. It becomes a presence. The stones seem to shift, though they do not move. The terraces seem to breathe, though there is no wind. The silence is not empty. It is full, weighted with something that has no name in English or Spanish or Quechua, something that exists only in the space between what is known and what is felt. This is what draws people here. Not the history, though the history is fascinating. Not the architecture, though the architecture is unparalleled. But the sense that Machu Picchu is still listening, still watching, still waiting for something to be understood. The mainstream narrative is complete. We know who built it, why they built it, when they left. The archaeological record is robust. The timelines are clear. Machu Picchu is no longer a mystery in the way it was when Bingham first stumbled onto the ridge. And yet, the unfinished staircase still leads nowhere. The hidden chamber still remains sealed. The Intihuatana still casts its precise shadows, measuring time in a language that no one speaks. The alternative histories persist because the orthodox story, for all its evidence, does not account for the feeling. It does not explain why standing in the sacred plaza at sunset makes you want to weep, or why walking the terraces at dawn feels like trespassing on something sacred, or why the stones seem to hold memory in a way that transcends archaeology. Maybe the Inca built atop something older. Maybe they inherited knowledge from cultures we have forgotten. Maybe the ridge was chosen not by human hands, but by something deeper, an alignment of geography and energy and meaning that called the people across millennia. That said, here, build here, and you will touch something eternal. Or maybe the mystery is simpler. Maybe Machu Picchu is exactly what it appears to be. A city built by a brilliant empire. A place where priests and artisans and emperors came to be close to the gods, and then left when the world changed. But even if that is the whole truth, even if there are no hidden chambers, or ancient secrets or encoded star maps, even if every stone was laid by Inca hands in the 15th century, and not a moment earlier, even then, Machu Picchu remains a question. Because some places do not need lost civilizations or alien architects or forgotten technologies to be extraordinary. Some places are extraordinary simply because they exist, because someone, somewhere, looked at a ridge on the edge of the sky and thought, yes, this is where we belong. And they built accordingly. The city watches the clouds. The clouds watch the city. The river carves its path below, as it has for longer than stone has had a name. And the mist rises, and the sun breaks through, and the tourists arrive with their cameras and their guidebooks, and they walk the same stones that emperors walked, and they do not fully understand what they are seeing, but they feel it. They feel it. That is enough.